Imagine the air in New York City in the summer of 1929. It didn't smell like exhaust or industry. It smelled like pure, unadulterated optimism. This was the era of the Roaring Twenties, a decade where the American dream had transitioned from a quiet hope for a better life into a loud, neon-lit demand for immediate wealth. To understand the shocking facts behind the eventual collapse, one must first understand the intoxicating high that preceded it. In the history books, we often see the 1920s as a montage of flappers, jazz, and illegal gin, but the hidden history is that the stock market had become the nation's new religion. It wasn't just the American industrial tycoon or the Wall Street banker who were playing the game. It was the ordinary American worker, the barbers, the teachers, and the taxi drivers who believed they were one ticker-tape parade away from becoming millionaires. The truth behind this era was a collective hallucination fueled by the belief that the market would only ever go up. For the first time in human history, luxury seemed democratized. Radio sets, Ford Model Ts, and vacuum cleaners were pouring into homes, not because people had the cash, but because they had discovered the seductive power of credit. The American dream was being sold on an installment plan, a deceptive promise that you could have the life of a tycoon while earning the wage of a laborer. This part of the forgotten tales of 1929 reveals a society that had decoupled itself from the reality of production and tied its soul to the flickering numbers on a chalkboard in Lower Manhattan. There was a sense of invincibility that defined the American psyche. The Great War was over. The colonial soldier and Civil War general were figures of the past, and the new hero was the man who could navigate the secret war of speculation. This era is often called the Golden Age, but as we explore these dark files, we see that the gold was merely a thin leaf covering a foundation of shifting sand. Politicians and economists of the day, including the most premium leaders in Washington, were shouting from the rooftops that America had entered a permanent plateau of prosperity. They told the public that poverty was being abolished and that every American was entitled to a piece of the corporate pie. This wasn't just a financial trend, it was a psychological operation that convinced a generation that the old rules of gravity, what goes up must come down, no longer applied to the United States. The declassified reality is that while the stock market was soaring by over 20% year after year, the underlying economy was beginning to stall. Farmers were already suffering, and wages for the ordinary American worker weren't keeping pace with the soaring prices of stocks. Yet, the music played on. The jazz clubs of Harlem and the ballrooms of the Waldorf Astoria were filled with people who felt like they had finally cracked the code to eternal wealth. This was the true story of a nation that had fallen in love with its own reflection, unaware that the mirror was about to shatter into a million jagged pieces. As the sun set on that fateful summer of 1929, the American dream felt like a tangible, reachable reality for the millions who had invested their life savings, their hopes, and their very identities into the ticker tape. Little did they know that they were standing on the edge of the darkest moment in American history, a cliff so steep that it would take an entire decade to crawl back from the bottom. The cruel truth was that the dream was already dead. It just hadn't stopped breathing, yet. To understand the cruel truth of the 1929 collapse, we must look past the glittering parties and examine the cold, calculated architecture of a trap that was built beneath the floorboards of the American economy. This wasn't a tragedy of errors. It was a systemic failure designed by the American industrial tycoon and the Wall Street banker of the era, who realized that they could infinitely multiply their wealth by turning the ordinary American worker into a lifelong debtor. The shocking fact that is rarely highlighted in standard history books is the mechanism known as buying on margin. Imagine a world where you could walk into a brokerage firm with just $10 and walk out with $100 worth of stock. The broker would lend you the other $90 using the stock itself as collateral. In the hidden history of 1929, this was marketed as the ultimate democratization of wealth, a secret code to the American dream that allowed the janitor to sit at the same digital table as the Vanderbilt family. However, the truth behind this arrangement was far more sinister. This leverage created a house of cards where even a minor dip in stock prices could trigger a catastrophic chain reaction. When the market grew, everyone felt like a genius. But the Wall Street banker knew that these loans, known as call loans, could be demanded back at any moment. This created a psychological debt trap that transformed the ordinary American worker from a cautious saver into a desperate gambler. The financial institutions of the 1920s were not the regulated entities we see today. They were more akin to wild casinos where the house always held the deck. They used premium 2D historical cartoon illustration style marketing, metaphorically speaking, to paint a picture of effortless success, while the reality was a cruel truth of systemic instability. The architecture of a trap also involved the banks themselves, which began using their depositors' savings to play the stock market. People who never even bought a share of stock were unknowingly being bet on the craps table of Wall Street by the very institutions meant to protect them. This was a black file level of betrayal that standard education often glosses over. The narrative sold to the public was one of rugged individualism, a term often used by the political elite to suggest that if you weren't rich, it was simply because you weren't trying hard enough. This deception of the American dream suggested that the market was a meritocracy, ignoring the fact that it was being manipulated by investment trusts and stock pools where the ultra-wealthy would collude to drive a stock price up, lure in the ordinary American worker, and then dump their shares at the peak, leaving the little man holding an empty bag. This was the unsolved mystery of why so many lost everything while a few managed to exit, with their fortunes intact just weeks before the crash. The architecture of a trap was further reinforced by the media of the time. The newspaper journalist of the 1920s was often on the payroll of the big firms, writing glowing reviews of companies that existed only on paper. There was no SEC, no oversight, and no warning for the millions who were pouring their life savings into what were essentially legal Ponzi schemes. The cinematic lighting of the era's prosperity blinded the nation to the dramatic chaos being engineered in the shadows. Every time the ordinary American worker signed a margin agreement, they were placing their family's future in the hands of a Wall Street banker who was sweating not from fear, but from greed. This period of hidden American history serves as a grim reminder that when a financial system makes wealth seem too easy, it is usually because it has found a way to commodify the hope of the masses. The cruel truth is that the 1920s weren't just a decade of excess. They were a decade of predatory engineering. The architecture of a trap was complete by the summer of 1929. The bait was the American dream, the trap was debt, and the victims were an entire generation of Americans who believed the premium lifestyle was their birthright. As the ticker tape machines hummed in the background, the Wall Street banker watched the numbers climb, knowing that the shocking fact was about to be revealed. The money wasn't real, but the debt was. This part of the forgotten tales reminds us that the greatest deceptions are often the ones we choose to believe in, because the alternative, that our prosperity is a fragile illusion, is too terrifying to face. The stage was set, the bold composition of the disaster was drawn, and all that was needed was a single spark to bring the entire architecture of a trap crashing down on the heads of the unsuspecting public. The ticking clock of October 1929 did not sound like a standard timepiece. It sounded like the frantic, stuttering mechanical chatter of the ticker tape machines that were slowly falling behind the reality of a collapsing nation. To understand the shocking facts of the days leading up to the great crash, we must enter the smoke-filled rooms of 23 Wall Street, where the Wall Street banker and the American industrial tycoon attempted to play God with the American economy. The hidden history of mid-October reveals a series of tremors that the public was told to ignore. On October 24th, now known as Black Thursday, the first true crack appeared, Nearly 13 million shares changed hands in a frenzy of panic, a volume so high that the ticker tape fell, hours behind, leaving investors in the ordinary American worker class completely blind to the fact that their life savings were evaporating in real time. As the dramatic chaos unfolded on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, a secret war was being waged behind closed doors. At noon, the most powerful men in finance, representatives from J.P. Morgan, National City Bank, and Chase National Bank, huddled together in a desperate attempt to stabilize the market. This was the architecture of a trap evolving into a great deception. They pooled their resources, roughly $20 to $30 million, not to save the public, but to save their own premium interests. The true story of this meeting is one of calculated theater. They chose Richard Whitney, the vice president of the exchange and a classic Wall Street banker figure, to perform a feat of financial heroism. Whitney walked onto the floor with a confident smile and conspicuously placed a massive order for U.S. steel at a price well above the current market. It was a cinematic lighting moment designed to signal to the masses that the Titans still had control. For a brief moment, the deception of the American dream worked. The panic subsided, and the market recovered slightly. The newspaper journalists of the era, many of whom were fed classified tips by these very bankers, heralded Whitney as the man who saved Wall Street. But this was merely a shocking fact of temporary manipulation. Over the weekend, the warning signs were everywhere. Across the country, the ordinary American worker was staring at his bank book with panic expressions, realizing that the rich shading of the 1920s was fading into a cold, gray reality. The declassified truth of that weekend was that the bankers themselves were quietly offloading their own holdings while publicly urging the public to buy the dip. This was the cruel truth behind the American dream. The elite were building lifeboats for themselves while telling the passengers that the Titanic was unsinkable. As Monday morning approached, the ticking clock grew louder. The hidden history shows that the volume of sell orders sitting on brokers' desks by Monday morning was unprecedented. The Wall Street banker knew the secret war was lost. Yet, the public was still being fed forgotten tales of a quick recovery. The atmosphere in Lower Manhattan was thick with dramatic shadows and a sense of impending doom that no amount of cinematic sidelighting could hide. The ordinary American worker who had bought on margin was now receiving margin calls, demands for cash they didn't have to cover stocks that were no longer worth the paper they were printed on. This was the unsolved mystery for many. How could a system that felt so premium and stable on Friday become a horrifying secret by Monday? The deception was that the market's value was never based on the American industrial tycoons' factories or the ordinary American workers' labor. It was based on the shocking fact of collective belief, and that belief was shattered. As the bells rang to open the session on October 28th, Black Monday, the ticking clock reached its midnight. The bankers' pool of money was gone, vanished, like smoke in a battlefield smoke background. There was no Richard Whitney to save them this time. The hidden American history of this specific moment captures the transition from a financial crisis to a national tragedy. The newspaper journalist began to see the sweating faces of the elites who realized they had unleashed a monster they could no longer control. The American dream was being exposed as a cruel truth of predatory speculation. Every tick of the machine was a heartbeat of a dying era. The true story of the ticking clock is that it wasn't just measuring time. It was measuring the distance between the deception of the past and the cruel reality of the future. By the time the sun went down on Monday, the Wall Street banker and the ordinary American worker were finally in the same boat, staring into the abyss of Black Tuesday. The shocking fact remains that even after the catastrophic losses of Monday, the leaders of the financial world still tried to maintain a confident smile, promising that the worst was over, a hidden history of lies that would lead to the total annihilation of the American dream the very next day. This part of the Black Files reminds us that when the ticking clock of greed meets the wall of reality, The explosion is felt by every ordinary American worker for generations to come. The cinematic lighting of Wall Street was about to be extinguished, replaced by the moody lighting of a decade-long Great Depression. The deception of the American dream is perhaps the most profound hidden history of the 1929 collapse, as it reveals how a national ethos was transformed into a weapon of psychological warfare against the ordinary American worker. To understand this cruel truth, we must look beyond the stock tickers and into the very soul of the American identity during the late 1920s. For decades, the narrative of the American dream, though the term itself wouldn't be popularized by James Truslow Adams until 1931, was centered on the idea of meritocracy, the belief that through hard work, grit, and rugged individualism, any ordinary American worker could rise to the status of an American industrial tycoon. However, as we examine the dark files of the pre-crash era, we see that this dream was systematically re-engineered to serve the interests of the Wall Street banker. In the premium 2D historical cartoon illustration of the Roaring Twenties, the deception was built on the premise that wealth was a direct reflection of moral character. If the market was going up, it was because America was virtuous, and if you were getting rich on margin, you were simply smarter than those who weren't. This created a secret code where financial success was equated with human value, setting a trap of immense proportions for when the bubble finally burst. The shocking fact that history books often gloss over is that when Black Tuesday struck, it didn't just destroy bank accounts, it annihilated the self-worth of millions. Because the American dream preached that every man was the architect of his own fortune, the corollary was a cruel truth. Every man was also the architect of his own ruin. The ordinary American worker, who had been lured into the market by the deceptive promises of investment tycoons, suddenly found himself not only broke but burdened with a sense of personal failure and shame. This was the hidden history of the breadlines. Men who had once worn premium suits were now hiding their faces, convinced that their poverty was a mark of their own inadequacy rather than the result of a systemic architecture of a trap designed by Wall Street bankers. The true story of the 1920s shows that the American dream was being sold as a commodity, fueled by the rise of mass advertising and the newspaper journalist who served as a mouthpiece for corporate interests. They created a cinematic lighting around consumption, suggesting that the ordinary American worker was less than if he didn't own the latest Ford or the most shares of RCA. This deception effectively replaced the original dream of liberty and self-sufficiency with a dream of endless accumulation and debt-funded luxury. The shocking fact is that this was a secret war on the American psyche, designed to ensure that the industrial city background was constantly fueled by a workforce that was perpetually chasing an unreachable horizon. When the crash happened, the American industrial tycoon and the Wall Street banker were the first to call for austerity and belt-tightening, weaponizing the American dream once again to suggest that the ordinary American worker had been too greedy. This is the cruel truth of victim-blaming in American history. The very people who were encouraged to gamble their life savings were told that their loss was a lesson in character once the house took all their chips. The hidden history of the 1930s is filled with forgotten tales of fathers leaving their families in the middle of the night, unable to bear the dramatic shadows of their perceived failure to provide, a direct result of the deception that their worth was tied to their net worth. Even the George Washington or Abraham Lincoln archetypes of leadership seemed to vanish in this era, replaced by a Wall Street banker with a sweating face who offered no solutions, only excuses. The American dream had become a black file of broken promises. See the bold composition of this deception in the way the government responded or failed to respond. The rugged individualism ideology was used as a shield by the elite to avoid providing a social safety net, arguing that charity would destroy the American character. This shocking fact highlights a cruel truth. The dream was a secret code for a system that prioritized capital over people. The ordinary American worker was left to navigate a battlefield smoke of unemployment and foreclosure with nothing but the forgotten tales of 1920s prosperity to keep them warm. The deception was so deep that it took a decade and a literal world war to shift the narrative back toward collective responsibility. As we look through these darkest moments, we must recognize that the American dream in 1929 wasn't just a goal. It was a gaslighting campaign. It convinced a nation that the architecture of a trap was actually a staircase to heaven. The true story of Blackie. Tuesday is the story of a people waking up from a premium dream to find themselves in a cruel reality where the American dream was merely a deception used to hide the shocking facts of a rigged economy. This part of the hidden American history serves as a warning to all future generations. When the American dream becomes synonymous with a stock price, the cruel truth is never far behind, and the ordinary American worker is always the one left to pay the bill. The silence that followed the final bell of Black Tuesday was not the quiet of peace, but the stifling stillness of a nation holding its breath, waiting for a recovery that would never come. This part of our hidden history explores the immediate and devastating transition from the roaring excess of the 20s to the silent banks and the empty pockets that defined the dawn of the Great Depression. While the Wall Street banker was busy burning records or hiding behind the bold composition of mahogany doors, the ordinary American worker was waking up to a cruel truth. The money they had entrusted to the system was gone, not just from their brokerage accounts, but from their very bank savings. The shocking fact of 1929 is that the contagion of the crash did not stay on Wall Street. It flowed like a poisonous ink across a parchment map of the United States, infecting every small-town bank from Maine to California. This was the era of the bank run, a phenomenon of dramatic chaos where trust, the invisible currency of the American dream, evaporated in a single afternoon. Imagine the ordinary American worker standing in a line that stretched for blocks in the industrial city background, the cinematic lighting of a cold autumn morning, highlighting the tired but hopeful faces that were rapidly turning to masks of panic expression. They weren't there to speculate. They were there to get the money they needed for rent, for milk, for life. But the cruel truth was that the architecture of a trap had extended to the local savings and loan. Under the hidden history of the time, banks had used depositors' cash to fund the very margin loans that had fueled the stock market bubble. When the Wall Street banker defaulted, the local bank's reserves vanished. When the ordinary American worker reached the teller window, they didn't find their life savings. They found a silent bank with a brass sign reading "Closed." This was a black file moment for the American psyche, the realization that the secret code of financial security was a deception. The true story of these bank failures reveals that between 1929 and 1933, nearly 9,000 banks vanished, taking with them over $7 billion in deposits, money that belonged to people who had never bought a single share of stock. This shocking fact created a scar that never heals, a generational trauma that transformed a nation of optimists into a nation of hoarders who hid cash under mattresses and in floorboards. The cinematic side lighting of the era's photography captures the rich shading of despair in the eyes of fathers who had to return home and tell their families that the American dream had been foreclosed upon. The transition from luxury to breadlines was so jarring it felt like a dramatic twist in a dark novel. Men who only weeks ago were discussing the premium features of a new Chrysler were now seen in the deep red glow of sunset, standing in breadlines that snaked through the colonial town squares. This was the cruel truth of the deception. The system was designed to privatize the gains for the American industrial tycoon while socializing the losses among the ordinary American worker. The hidden American history of the soup kitchens reveals a horrifying secret that many of the people serving the food were themselves recently unemployed professionals, Wall Street bankers who had lost everything, and newspaper journalists whose papers had folded. The American dream had been replaced by a secret war for survival. Every ordinary American worker was now an ordinary American beggar in the eyes of a system that no longer had a use for them. The warning signs that the government ignored led to a dramatic chaos where the industrial city background became a graveyard of stalled machinery and empty pockets. The shocking fact is that during this time, while millions were starving, food was being destroyed to keep prices up, a cruel truth of capitalism that standard education rarely emphasizes. The deception was complete. The American dream had told them that poverty was a choice, but in the shadow of the silent banks, they realized it was a sentence. The Wall Street banker with his expensive black suit was now a figure of loathing, a shocking fact that fueled the rise of radical movements and a deep-seated distrust of the premium elite. As the pockets of the nation grew empty, the black files of the era show a massive increase in forgotten tales of displacement, families loading their meager belongings onto beat-up trucks, becoming Okies or transients in their own land. The cinematic lighting of these migrant camps with their torch fire glow mirrored the revolutionary battlefield smoke of the past. But the enemy this time wasn't a colonial soldier. It was an invisible ledger. The true story of the silent banks is the story of a total systemic collapse where the deception of the American dream was finally seen for what it was, a premium facade for a fragile and predatory architecture of a trap. This part of the hidden history reminds us that when the banks go silent, the voices of the people grow loud with a panic expression that can change the course of democracy forever. The ordinary American worker learned that their empty pockets were not a sign of their failure, but a sign of a shocking fact. They had been the fuel for a machine that never intended to share the wealth. The cruel truth of the aftermath is that the American dream didn't just end. It was stolen, and the silent banks were the vaults where the evidence was buried. As we look at the bold composition of 1930, we see a nation stripped of its gold and navy blue authority, left with only the dark brown of the dirt and the deep red of its wounds. This was the darkest moment yet, a period of hidden American history that proved that the deception of wealth is only as strong as the silent banks that claim to hold it. Behind the cold, jagged lines of the stock market graph lay a cruel truth that no ticker tape could ever quantify: the systematic disintegration of the American family unit and the shattering of the human spirit. To understand the darkest moments in American history, we must look past the shocking fact of $30 billion lost and look into the eyes of the ordinary American worker who, for the first time in his life, found himself standing in a bread line under the moody lighting of a dying industrial city. This wasn't just a financial crisis. It was a psychological massacre. The deception of the American dream had convinced a generation that their bank balance was a mirror of their soul. So when that balance hit zero, their sense of dignity vanished along with. The hidden history of 1930 is written in the forgotten tales of Hoovervilles, sprawling shantytowns built of cardboard, rusted tin, and broken promises that emerged in the industrial city background of every major metropolis. These were not just slums. They were monuments to the Great Deception, ironically named after President Herbert Hoover, whom the public felt had abandoned them to the dramatic chaos of the market. Inside these shacks, the ordinary American worker and his family lived a true story of deprivation that schoolbooks often sanitize. Imagine a colonial town or a modern suburb where the cinematic lighting of the sunset no longer hits the windows of a home, but the edges of a scrap metal shelter. The shocking fact is that thousands of children were forced out of school to wander the railroads as wild boys and boxcar girls, a hidden history of a lost generation who traded their education for the chance to scavenge for scraps. The human toll was most evident in the panic expression of fathers who could no longer look their children in the eye. The suicide rates during this period are a black file of American despair, while the media focused on the wall, street banker jumping from a ledge. The cruel truth is that far more ordinary American workers quietly turned on the gas or swallowed poison in the dramatic shadows of their foreclosed kitchens, unable to bear the weight of a deception they thought was their own fault. The architecture of a trap had successfully privatized the shame of a systemic failure. Women, too, bore a shocking burden, struggling to maintain the rich shading of a normal household while stretching. A single loaf of bread across an entire week, a forgotten tale of domestic heroism in the face of absolute ruin. The American dream had promised that if you played by the rules, you would be protected. But the cruel truth was that the rules had been rewritten by the American industrial tycoon to ensure their own survival at the expense of the masses. As the newspaper journalist of the time documented these darkest moments, they saw a nation transitioning from anger to a hollow, haunting apathy. The cinematic side-lighting of history reveals the ordinary American worker sitting on a curb, staring at his hands that were ready to work but had nothing to build. A true story of a nation's greatest resource, being left to rot. This part of the hidden American history reminds us that the economy is not just a collection of numbers, it is the heartbeat of the people, and in 1930, that heart was failing. The shocking fact of the Great Depression is not how much money was lost, but how much hope was stolen by the deception that preceded it. The Hoovervilles became the new colonial soldier camps, but instead of fighting for independence, they were fighting for a bowl of watery soup in a battlefield smoke of industrial decay. The cruel truth of the American dream was that it had no contingency plan for failure. Every ordinary American worker was a casualty in a secret war. They didn't even know they were fighting, a war between the premium illusions of the elite and the harsh reality of the dirt. The forgotten tales of this era are filled with stories of families walking hundreds of miles toward a deceptive promise of work in California, only to find more Hoovervilles and more panic expressions. The human toll went beyond the numbers to infect the very language of the country. Hoover blankets were old newspapers, and Hoover hogs were jackrabbits caught for food, a shocking fact of how a once proud people had been reduced to scavengers by the architecture of a trap. This part of the Black Files is essential for understanding the modern American psyche, for the scar that never heals was forged in these years of dramatic chaos and moody lighting. As the ordinary American worker looked up at the Congress Hall or the White House from their cardboard box, they realized that the George Washington or Abraham Lincoln style of leadership was nowhere to be found, replaced by a wall. Street banker mindset that prioritized the gold of the few over the bread of the many. This was the cruel truth of the 1930s. The dream had died, and the funeral was being held in every vacant lot and alleyway across the continent. The shocking fact remains that the greatest deception wasn't the market crash itself, but the lie that told the ordinary American worker they were alone in their suffering. As we continue through these darkest moments, we see that the human toll was a warning that went unheeded, a true story of what happens when a nation values the premium facade over the ordinary reality of its citizens. Takao, the deception of the American dream had left a scar so deep that it would redefine what it meant to be American for the next century, proving that when the architecture of a trap snaps shut, the numbers are the last thing that matters. To see the true face of the Great Depression, one must look at the abandoned farms of the Midwest, where the Dust Bowl added a literal battlefield smoke to the cruel truth of economic collapse, turning the American dream into a choking black grit. This was the true story of a nation that had traded its soul for a stock price and found itself bankrupt in every sense of the word. A shocking fact that modern Wall Street would prefer we forget. But the hidden history of the people will always remember. The shattered mirage of government during the early years of the Great Depression is a hidden history of a leadership paralyzed by its own premium illusions and a secret war between ideology and reality. To understand why the government was so fundamentally unprepared for the dramatic chaos of 1929, we must look at the man in the White House, Herbert Hoover, a leader who possessed the stern, determined face of a George Washington or an Abraham Lincoln, but lacked the flexibility to adapt to a cruel truth that was destroying the American dream. Hoover was a self-made multimillionaire, the great engineer who had successfully fed millions during the Great War, yet his true story in 1929 was one of catastrophic miscalculation. He believed in a secret code of rugged individualism, the shocking fact being that he viewed government intervention not as a cure, but as a poison that would destroy the American character. As the ordinary American worker was being crushed by the architecture of a trap laid by the Wall Street banker, the government remained a shattered mirage, offering only forgotten tales of self-reliance while the foundations of the country were crumbling. The deception was that the American industrial tycoon would voluntarily keep wages high and factories open out of a sense of patriotic duty. Hoover's warning to businesses was a mere whisper against the dramatic shadows of a collapsing global market. The shocking fact of 1930 was the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, an act of rugged individualism gone wrong that ignited a secret war of trade protectionism, effectively strangling what little remained of international commerce and turning a stock market crash into a worldwide darkest moment. This was a black file of economic incompetence where the premium leaders in Congress Hall believed they could isolate America from a cruel truth that had no borders. The cinematic lighting of Hoover's early presidency, often depicted in gold and navy blue authority, quickly faded into the dark brown of the dirt and the deep red of national anger. The ordinary American worker looked toward the White House and saw only a shattered mirage, a government that was more concerned with balancing a budget than balancing the lives of its citizens. The horrifying secret of this era was the Bonus Army incident of 1932, a true story that schoolbooks often abbreviate. Thousands of colonial soldier descendants, veterans of World War I, marched on Washington to demand early payment of their service certificates. They built a massive Hooverville within sight of the ER Capitol, their tired but hopeful faces a living warning of the nation's despair. Instead of a George Washington style of empathy, the government responded with a Civil War general style of force. General Douglas MacArthur led troops with tanks and bayonets to burn the veterans' camps to the ground. This was the darkest moment for the shattered mirage of government, a shocking fact that revealed the cruel truth. The state would rather declare war on its own heroes than acknowledge the failure of its deceptive ideology. The cinematic side lighting of the burning camps, with torch fire glow illuminating the panic expression of veterans and their families, signaled the total death of the American dream under the Hoover administration. The newspaper journalist of the time captured the bold composition of a government at war with its people, documenting the hidden history of a leadership that had become an American industrial tycoon for the elite and a Civil War general for the poor. The secret code of the era was, prosperity is just around the corner, a deception that became a national joke as the ordinary American worker continued to starve in the moody lighting of the Depression. The government was not just unprepared, it was ideologically blinded, a true story of how premium branding and rugged individualism can become a horrifying secret when applied to a systemic collapse. Every time Hoover spoke of rugged individualism, it felt like a warning to the ordinary American worker that they were truly alone in the dramatic chaos. The shocking fact is that Hoover actually increased spending and created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, but it was too little, too late, and primarily targeted at saving the Wall Street banker rather than the ordinary American worker. This architecture of a trap ensured that the gold stayed at the top while the deep red drama was suffered at the bottom. The shattered mirage of government proved that a premium image cannot hide the cruel truth of a failed system. As the 1932 election approached, the ordinary American worker prepared to cast a vote that was less an act of hope and more an act of secret war against a shattered mirage that had promised a dream but delivered a nightmare. The hidden American history of Hoover's failure is a warning to all future leaders that when the deception of the American dream is exposed, the shocking facts of government inaction can destroy the very authority it seeks to protect. The cinematic lighting of the White House was about to shift, but the scars of the shattered Mirage would remain as a black file in the history documentary style of the American soul. The global domino effect of the 1929 crash was not just a side effect of a bad week on Wall Street, it was a shocking fact of systemic contagion that proved the American dream had been exported as a fragile, debt-laden deception to a post-war world. To understand this cruel truth, we must look at the hidden history of the 1920s, a period where the American industrial tycoon and the Wall Street banker had positioned the United States as the world's primary creditor, a secret war of financial dominance that made the global economy dependent on the premium stability of the American dollar. When the architecture of a trap snapped shut in New York City on Black Tuesday, the shockwaves traveled across the parchment map of the Atlantic with terrifying speed, proving that the deception of prosperity was a global house of cards. The true story of the international collapse begins with the sudden withdrawal of American capital. The Wall Street banker, facing his own panic expression and a sweating face, began calling in loans from European nations that were still struggling to rebuild from the battlefield, smoke of the First World War. Germany, in particular, was caught in a horrifying secret of debt. Under the Dawes Plan, American money had been the lifeblood of the Weimar Republic, and when that blood was sucked back into the industrial city background of America to cover margin calls, the German economy underwent a dramatic chaos that standard history often fails to capture in its full, deep red drama. The shocking fact is that as American banks failed, they triggered a global domino effect that saw the collapse of the Creditanstalt in Austria and the subsequent ruin of the British financial system, which was forced to abandon the gold standard, a secret code of global stability that had stood for generations. This was a black file of international catastrophe where the deception of the American dream was exposed as a global warning that went unheeded. The ordinary American worker was now joined by the ordinary German worker and the ordinary British worker in a shared true story of starvation and unemployment, a moody lighting that fell over the entire Western world. The cinematic lighting of the world's major cities shifted from the bright gold of progress to the dark brown of the dirt as trade was strangled by the shattered mirage of government and the cruel truth of protectionist policies like the Smoot-Hawley tariff. This secret war of trade barriers was a shocking fact of nationalistic ego that ensured the Depression would be both global and enduring, a hidden American history that taught us the high cost of isolationism. As the ordinary American worker looked at his empty pockets, he did not realize that his suffering was fueling the rise of extremism across the ocean, a true story of how economic despair can become the architecture of a trap for democratic institutions. In Germany, the shocking fact of 40% unemployment created the cinematic sidelighting for a new kind of American industrial tycoon of power, Adolf Hitler, who weaponized the cruel truth of economic ruin to promise a premium future of national strength. The hidden history of the 1930s shows that the American dream had been replaced by a global secret war of ideologies, where the shattered mirage of government in the West made the authoritarian bold composition of fascist regimes look like a viable alternative to ordinary citizens. This was a warning that the world had ignored. When a system based on deception and luxury suits fails, the people will turn to anyone who promises a secret code to survival. The shocking fact is that the 1929 crash didn't just cause the Great Depression. It laid the battlefield smoke for World War II by destroying the international cooperation that had kept the Civil War general and the colonial soldier in the past. Japan, too, felt the global domino effect. As American demand for silk and other exports vanished, the Japanese people suffered a dramatic chaos that led to the rise of a militant secret war for resources in Manchuria. The cinematic lighting of this era was deep red, signaling the approach of a global conflict that was birthed in the darkest moments of the New York Stock Exchange. The true story of the global domino effect is that it transformed the deception of the American dream into a global night of tragedy, where the architecture of a trap that began with buying on margin ended with the mobilization of millions for war. The newspaper journalist of the 1930s documented a world that was literally coming apart at the seams, a hidden history of how the gold of Wall Street was inextricably linked to the battlefield smoke of tomorrow. As we look through these black files, we see that the shocking fact of interconnectivity is both our greatest strength and our most cruel truth of vulnerability. The ordinary American worker and the world at large learned that when the deception at the heart of the premium economy is revealed, the global domino effect ensures that no one is safe from the dramatic chaos. This part of the hidden American history reminds us that the 1929 crash was a warning to all future generations about the dangers of a world built on secret codes of debt and deceptive promises of endless growth. The cinematic sidelighting of the Great Depression was merely the preamble to the deep red glow of the Second World War, a true story of how a single darkest moment can echo across history forever. The global domino effect proved that the American dream was never a solo act. It was a performance on a world stage, and when the Wall Street banker forgot his lines, the entire world suffered the cruel truth of the silence that followed. Every ordinary American worker who lost his home was a shocking fact that contributed to a global instability that would eventually cost 50 million lives. This is the Black File of 1929, a true story of how a local architecture of a trap became a global secret war for the soul of humanity, proving that the deception of one nation can become the night of tragedy for all. As we reach the final part of this series, we must understand that the global domino effect was the definitive warning that the American dream can only exist if it is built on a foundation of cruel truth rather than premium lies. The scar that never heals is the definitive hidden history of the 1929 crash, a mark left not just on the ledgers of the Wall Street banker, but on the very DNA of the American experience. To understand the legacy of Black Tuesday, we must look at how the cruel truth of that darkest moment fundamentally rewrote the secret code of American governance and transformed the ordinary American worker from a silent laborer into a vocal claimant of the American dream. The immediate legacy was the death of rugged individualism and the birth of a secret war for a social safety net, a true story of how a nation forced its government to abandon the shattered mirage of non-interference. The shocking fact is that the regulations we take for granted today, the FDIC, the SEC, and the very concept of Social Security, were forged in the battlefield smoke of the Great Depression's dramatic chaos. The Wall Street banker of 1929, with his sweating face and panic expression, became the catalyst for the Glass-Steagall Act, a forbidden history of how the government finally moved to separate the gambling of speculators from the life savings of the ordinary American worker. This part of the WWII Black Files reveals that the deception of the American dream was so profound that it required a total structural overhaul to prevent the architecture of a trap from snapping shut again. As the newspaper journalist of the 1930s documented the transition to the New Deal, they saw a nation trying to reclaim its gold and navy blue authority through collective action rather than predatory competition. However, the cruel truth remains that the scar that never heals is the haunting realization that greed is cyclical and the deception is always being rebranded for a new generation. We see the bold composition of 1929 echoed in the shocking facts of the 2008 financial crisis and the secret war of modern market volatility, where the ordinary American worker is once again told to buy the dip while the elite prepare their exit strategy. The cinematic lighting of modern prosperity often hides the same dramatic shadows that preceded Black Tuesday, a warning that history does not repeat, but it certainly rhymes in high contrast. The true story of the American dream today is a complex architecture of a trap, where debt is still marketed as a premium lifestyle and the ordinary American worker is still chasing a forgotten tale of effortless wealth. This hidden American history serves as a forbidden mirror, showing us that the scar that never heals is actually a shocking fact of human nature. The desire for more will always, eventually collide with the reality of the dirt. As we close these dark files, we must ask ourselves if we have truly learned the cruel truth of Black Tuesday, or if we are simply waiting for the next night of tragedy to reveal the latest deception. The Wall Street banker might have a different suit today, and the ordinary American worker might have a different industrial city background, but the architecture of a trap remains the same. This is the unsolved mystery of the American soul. Why do we continue to believe in the premium illusion when the cruel truth is written in the battlefield smoke of our past? We must remember that the American dream is only as strong as our willingness to look at the shocking facts of our darkest moments and demand a secret code that values people over ticker tape. The newspaper journalist will always be there to record the dramatic chaos, but the ordinary American worker is the only one who can break the cycle of deception. This has been the true story of Black Tuesday, a warning from the hidden history of a nation that lost its way in the cinematic lighting of greed. If this journey through the black files has moved you, if you've felt the panic expression of 1929 and the tired but hopeful spirit of the ordinary American worker, then your voice is part of the secret war for a better truth. Like this video to help others find the forbidden reality of our past and share it to warn them about the architecture of a trap that still surrounds us. Subscribe to Many Histories to unlock more declassified secrets from the history documentary style of the American experience, and comment below, do you think the American dream is still a deception, or can we build a true story worth believing in? The gold may be tarnished and the deep red drama may be painful, but only by facing the cruel truth can we hope to heal the scar that never heals. Stay focused, stay curious, and never stop questioning the premium facade, for the hidden history is the only thing that can set us free from the dramatic chaos of the future. Thank you for walking through the darkest moments in American history with us. The secret code is in your hands now.